Dawn broke on June 4, 1942, over the vast Pacific, with the sky painted in bruised gray and streaks of crimson fire. Off Midway Atoll, engines roared to life, propellers churned the humid air, and radios crackled with clipped, nervous chatter. Above the waves, Japanese carrier-based Mitsubishi A6M Zeros, the most feared fighters in the world, sliced through the clouds with lethal grace. Their wings shimmered in the morning light as if untouchable. For months, Allied pilots whispered the same truth. The Zero was invincible in a turning fight, unbeatable in climb and deadly in speed. Yet on this morning, Japanese pilots looked down in disbelief as American fighters, planes once mocked as clumsy and slow, suddenly darted, climbed and twisted with a ferocity that defied everything they had been told. U.S. Navy After-Action Report, June 1942. The radio discipline of the Japanese was broken by stunned exclamations. Air-dramatized composite voice shouted over static, "They are climbing with us, impossible! Impossible!" Machine gun bursts stitched across the sky. For the first time in the Pacific War, American fighters were not prey, they were predators. Pilot Combat Diary, 1942. To understand this shocking reversal, one must return to the early months of World War II. By the time Pearl Harbor burned on December 7, 1941, the Mitsubishi A6M Zero was the terror of the Pacific. With a top speed of over 330 mph, a climb rate exceeding 3,000 feet per minute, and the agility to turn inside nearly any Allied aircraft, it had already carved its legend over China. In the opening 6 months of the Pacific War, Zeros racked up kill ratios as high as 12-1 against American aircraft. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. The U.S. Navy and Army Air Forces bled badly. Their outdated Brewster Buffaloes and Curtiss P-40s shredded in dogfights where the outcome seemed inevitable. For Japanese aviators, the war felt like destiny. A storm they controlled, but war is not destiny. It is adaptation, invention, and the grind of industrial power. While Japanese pilots celebrated their supremacy deep in American hangars and factories, engineers and test pilots worked furiously. At Grumman's plant in Bethpage, New York, engineers like Leroy Grumman and Robert Hall listened closely to pilot feedback, welding heavier frames, designing folding wings for carriers, and experimenting with rugged engines that could take punishment and still roar. Across the Midwest, in factories powered by Detroit's auto industry, production lines were already gearing to churn out the machines that would tilt the balance of the skies. Grumman Engineering Memo, 1941. At sea, the early battles revealed the nightmare American pilots faced. At Wake Island, at the Coral Sea, and in the Philippines, Zeros seemed unstoppable. Even the famed Flying Tigers in China, flying Curtiss P-40s, survived only by using brutal hit-and-run dives, never daring to turn with the Zero. A young Marine pilot wrote bitterly, "We could dive away. We could not outfight them. Our planes felt like trucks in the air." Marine Aviator Letter, Jan 1942. The Japanese, confident and unchallenged, believed their dominance would last indefinitely. Training films and pilot manuals assured them that no American aircraft could match their climb, turn, or acceleration. They considered the war in the Pacific to be an open sky for the taking. Imperial Japanese Navy Pilot Handbook, 1941. And yet, something was changing. By the spring of 1942, at Midway and the Aleutians, and later in the Solomon Islands, American fighters began to behave differently. Pilots who once dreaded close combat suddenly fought back with sharp, slashing maneuvers. They no longer avoided vertical climbs. They pressed them. They no longer collapsed in spirals beneath Zero gunfire. They reversed, bit back, and shredded Japanese formations. Reports flowed back to Tokyo. The enemy's planes were holding altitude, keeping pace, and tearing into squadrons that should have outflown them with ease. Japanese Air Staff Report, July 1942. The shock ran deep. For months, Japanese intelligence had dismissed American fighters as inferior in both design and production. The Zero's light frame, stripped of armor and self-sealing fuel tanks, had been its deadly edge, sacrificing protection for performance. American engineers, by contrast, built heavy armored planes, slower on paper but durable. Now, inexplicably, these same clumsy aircraft were twisting into battle with predatory speed. A dramatized composite Japanese pilot wrote, "Their planes were like wolves, faster, climbing with us, striking from above." It should not be possible. Numbers tell the broader truth. In 1942, the Japanese had roughly 3,000 frontline combat aircraft across their empire. The United States, within that same year, was producing 4,800 aircraft of every type. U.S. War Production Board, 1943. The Zero may have been a masterpiece of design, but America was becoming a factory of war, building not only planes but the logistical systems, spare parts, and training schools to sustain them. For every pilot Japan graduated, America trained 5. For every Zero produced in a workshop with handcrafted precision, Grumman and General Motors stamped out Wildcats and Avengers in roaring assembly lines. The balance was shifting, invisibly at first, but inevitably. By late summer 1942, as the Guadalcanal campaign ignited, Japanese pilots who had once hunted with arrogance now spoke in whispers of the strange resilience of American fighters. The Grumman F-4F Wildcat, derided as slow and lumbering, was surviving battles, returning riddled with holes that should have killed its pilot, landing on carriers with engines still coughing smoke. Pilots began to notice something else. Americans fought differently. They did not circle endlessly. They slashed, fired, and climbed again. They fought to their machine's strengths, exploiting durability and firepower instead of chasing impossible turns. U.S. Navy Pilot Training Bulletin 1942, and then a darker realization spread. Rumors circulated of new American fighters, planes faster, deadlier, and more agile than even the Wildcat. Whispered names: Hellcat, Corsair, Lightning. To Japanese ears, they sounded like omens. Japanese Pilot Interrogation Report, 1944. The Pacific skies, once a stage for Japanese dominance, were becoming uncertain. Something unseen was fueling American confidence. Something hidden beneath steel frames and roaring engines. Engineers and mechanics, working under fluorescent lights thousands of miles from the front, were embedding a secret into every bolt, every wing, every cockpit dial. That secret was beginning to surface in combat reports, in stunned Japanese radio calls, in shattered formations spiraling into the sea. The invincible Zero was no longer untouchable. Its myth was cracking, and as the wreckage of once proud Japanese squadrons drifted across the Pacific, a question hung heavy in the air. What hidden advantage had allowed American fighters to suddenly outfly the most feared aircraft of the war? The date was August 7, 1942. Dawn rose over Guadalcanal with a burning haze, humid and thick, as the first waves of U.S. Marines waded ashore. Overhead, the skies vibrated with the sound of engines, their growl steady, their rhythm new. American F-4F Wildcats circled above, guardians of the landing. Below, Japanese pilots climbed into their Zeros from bases at Rabaul, confident they would tear the invasion apart, as they had in the Philippines and Malaya. Yet when their squadrons streaked toward Guadalcanal, something terrifying awaited them. American fighters rose to meet them, held formation with discipline, and then, against every expectation, began to climb and dive with a fury that matched the Zero itself. U.S. Navy Combat Air Patrol Report, AUG 1942. The secret advantage was not a single weapon, but a fusion of technology, training, and doctrine. The first piece was radios, Motorola-built FM transmitters installed into Wildcats and later Hellcats. For the Japanese, who relied on hand signals, flags, or primitive short-range sets, coordination broke down as soon as combat scattered formations. American squadrons, by contrast, operated like packs of wolves. A flight leader could redirect his wingmen instantly, order altitude changes, or call for mutual defense with a simple transmission. Technical Manual TM 9294, 1942, the Japanese, who believed maneuver and instinct ruled the skies, suddenly faced enemies who fought as one brain. Many claws. The second piece was tactics. Major John S. Jimmy Thatch, a quiet, bespectacled naval officer, studied the Zero's flight performance long before facing it in battle. From intelligence reports and test flights of a captured Zero, he devised the Thatch Weave, a defensive maneuver where two American fighters crisscrossed, covering each other's tails. Against the Zero's agility, it was devastating. Japanese pilots who dove on one target suddenly found themselves under fire from the wingman. U.S. Navy Pilot Training Bulletin 1942. This tactical innovation spread quickly, taught in ready rooms aboard carriers, practiced endlessly over the Pacific. American fighters no longer fought alone. They fought as pairs, as teams, as systems. The third piece was engineering resilience. Grumman's F4F Wildcat was slower than the Zero by nearly 20 mph, less agile and inferior in climb rate, but it carried 650 caliber M2 Browning machine guns compared to the Zero's 2 rifle caliber guns and 2 20mm cannons with limited ammunition. More importantly, the Wildcat had self-sealing fuel tanks and armor plate behind the cockpit. A Zero hit in its fuel tank became a torch. A Wildcat riddled with holes could limp home, its pilot alive, its engine still coughing smoke. Japanese pilots began to despair as Americans survived fights that should have killed them, returned the next day and faced them again. Bureau of Aeronautics Performance Report 1942. Factories turned these lessons into war-winning hardware. At Grumman's Bethpage plant, welders, riveters and line workers labored 24 hours a day under floodlights. One engineer later recalled, "Every bolt we drove, every sheet of aluminum we riveted, we thought of the boy flying it. It had to come back." Grumman Factory Memoir 1943. In Akron, Ohio, Goodyear converted tire factories into assembly lines for the Vought F4U Corsair, a beast with a Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, delivering 2,000 horsepower and a top speed of 446 mph. Its bent wings, designed to house the massive propeller, earned it the nickname Whistling Death among Japanese opponents. Naval Aircraft Performance Test, 1943. Each innovation was backed not just by engineers but by the vast U.S. industrial machine, scaling production to levels Japan could never match. The Japanese, watching these changes unfold, could scarcely believe it. Their intelligence officers reported impossible specifications: fighters with heavier armor that still outran the Zero, guns that fired longer and hotter without jamming, radios that allowed Americans to swarm like insects over a single target. A dramatized composite Japanese officer wrote, "It was as though the Americans grew new wings in battle. Their coordination was supernatural." 1 Fort 3, Imperial Navy Debrief 1943. The climax came at Guadalcanal, where the thatch weave and the new confidence of American pilots were tested in full. On August 7th, Japanese Zeros from the Tainan Air Group engaged American Wildcats in what became known as the Battle of Tulagi and Gavutu. At first, the Zeros dived with familiar grace, slashing into the Marine invasion fleet. Yet the Wildcats countered with precision. Flying in pairs, their radio chatter crisp, they slashed back in coordinated fire. One Japanese ace, Sub-Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, scored hits, but was stunned to find his opponents returning fire even as their cockpits blazed. Incredibly, several crippled Wildcats landed safely, patched overnight by ground crews, and were flying again within 24 hours. U.S. Marine Squadron Report, OG 1942. The numbers told the grim truth. Over Guadalcanal, Japanese squadrons lost irreplaceable veterans in exchanges that once would have favored them. In 1 week of fighting, 94 Japanese aircraft fell for just 23 American losses. U.S. Navy After-Action Report, Sept 1942. Kill ratios had reversed. For every Zero that returned, 2 never did. And for every American lost, factories in the U.S. produced 3 replacements before the pilots bunk aboard a carrier grew cold. War Production Board 1942. Then came the arrival of the F-6F Hellcat in late 1942, a plane engineered specifically to dominate the Zero. With a top speed of 380 mph, a climb rate of 3,500 feet per minute, and a ceiling of 37 to 300 feet, the Hellcat could outdive, outclimb, and outgun its rival. Its 6 Brownings tore Zeros to shreds before they could close the distance. Naval Air Technical Data Sheet 1943. Built by Grumman under the leadership of Leroy Grumman himself, the Hellcat was rugged, reliable, and mass-produced. 12,275 were built during the war. By 1943, the invincible Zero was facing a predator it could no longer outfly. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey 1946. The technical miracle of America's sudden edge was not luck. It was science, engineering, and doctrine converging. Radios gave brains to formations. Tactics gave structure to combat. Factories gave wings to strategy. The thatch weave became a symbol of this transformation, not a single maneuver but a philosophy. Never fight alone, never fight the enemy's fight. Fight with machines designed to endure. And as Guadalcanal turned into a grinding 6-month campaign, the Japanese found themselves bleeding, not only pilots, but belief itself. Their dominance was over. By 1943, when Japanese squadrons intercepted American raids over Rabaul, the skies told the story. Hellcats, Wildcats, and Corsairs swarmed with coordination that stunned observers. A Japanese report noted, "We were overrun. They came from above below the sides." It was not combat. It was extermination. Japanese Air Staff War Diary, 1943. The advantage was no longer hidden. It was overwhelming, visible in every engagement, undeniable in every wreck pulled from the sea. And yet, beyond the smoke and wreckage, a larger truth was dawning. The battle for the skies was not just about planes or pilots. It was about psychology, about breaking the myth of invincibility, about proving that even the most feared weapon could be countered, dismantled, and surpassed. The question that lingered, as Japanese aces fell one by one, was this: what would the collapse of aerial supremacy do to the Japanese war effort, not just tactically, but strategically, and in the hearts of the men who once believed themselves untouchable? By 1943, the myth of the Zero had shattered. Once hailed as the invincible falcon of the Pacific, it was now a hunted bird, bleeding in the skies it once ruled. At Guadalcanal, the losses had been staggering, not only in aircraft but in irreplaceable pilots. The elite aviators trained since the 1930s in the Imperial Japanese Navy's brutal flight schools. Each Zero shot down carried with it hundreds of hours of lost training, and each pilot lost was a veteran who could not be replaced. In contrast, the United States was producing not just planes but pilots at an industrial scale, graduating thousands each month from schools in Florida, Texas, and California. U.S. Navy Training Command Report, 1943. The war in the air had shifted from duels of aces to a battle of systems, and the Japanese system was cracking. The psychological impact rippled across the Pacific. Japanese pilots, once confident enough to joke about American flying coffins, began writing somber reflections in their diaries. Their dramatized composite entry captured the despair. "We no longer own the skies. Their planes dive faster. Their guns fire longer. Their numbers are endless. To fight now feels like to swim against a tide of steel." Captured Pilot Diary, 1943. Interrogations of captured aviators later revealed disbelief at how swiftly the balance had turned. Many had been taught that American industry was clumsy, slow, incapable of producing refined fighters. Instead, they faced Hellcats and Corsairs, machines designed with brutal efficiency, flown by men who fought as one. For the Americans, the shift was more than tactical. It was spiritual. Survivors who once limped home in bullet-riddled Wildcats now returned with kills of their own. Pilots who had spent 1942 flying defensively now led formations into enemy skies. Squadron reports became infused with pride, recounting not just victories, but the sense of technological superiority. A Navy pilot wrote after a sortie over Rabaul, "We used to fear their turns, their climbs. Now we outpace them, outfight them. The hunter is hunted." U.S. Navy Squadron Log, Nov 1943. Behind these victories stood engineers and workers whose contributions rarely reached the front pages. Grumman's team of draftsmen and mechanics, led by Leroy Grumman himself, engineered fighters with rugged designs that could withstand punishment. At Pratt & Whitney, technicians perfected the R2800 double Wasp engine, a 2,000-horsepower powerhouse that roared inside Hellcats and Corsairs. In Detroit, the same assembly lines that once produced automobiles now turned out fuselages and wings. Their workers, often women known as Rosies, riveting steel with unrelenting speed. War Production Board Report, 1944. Their fingerprints were on every victory, their sweat embedded in every engine roar. Strategically, the shift meant far more than individual dogfights. Air superiority allowed American carriers to advance deeper into Japanese-held waters. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, the advantage became absolute. When over 300 Japanese aircraft surged toward the U.S. fleet, Hellcats met them in what pilots later called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. With radar guiding them and radios coordinating their attacks, Hellcats tore through the Zero formations. By day's end, nearly 250 Japanese aircraft lay in ruins, while American losses were minimal. U.S. Navy After-Action Report, June 1944. The massacre was more than a battle. It was the death knell of Japanese air power. Psychologically, this collapse corroded Japanese morale at every level. Post-war interrogations revealed that even senior officers admitted despair after the Marianas. A dramatized composite admiral confessed, "We sent our best and they died like sparks in the wind." We knew then we could not win. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. For Japan, the Zero had symbolized dominance. To see it fall was to see their empire's aura of invincibility torn away. Meanwhile, American pilots grew bolder. They developed reputations as relentless, confident, even cocky. But beneath the bravado lay a doctrine forged from blood. Fight as a team. Trust your radio. Never give the Zero the turning fight it wants. This doctrine shaped the entire U.S. Navy and Marine Corps aviation philosophy. Even ground crews adopted the spirit, working with tireless precision to keep planes flying. Every Hellcat or Corsair that lifted off represented not just a pilot, but the hundreds of mechanics, engineers, and workers who sustained it. Bureau of Aeronautics Maintenance Report, 1944. The human cost, however, remained immense. For every Zero that burned, there was a Japanese pilot lost, often a young man who believed he was serving a divine cause. For every American fighter shot down, a family back home received the dreaded telegram. War in the skies was not just statistics. It was lives extinguished, courage tested, grief multiplied. One Marine pilot, reflecting years later, admitted, "We respected them. They were brave men." But bravery could not outfight industry. Veteran Oral History Interview, 1962. The long shadow of this air war extended beyond 1945. The lessons learned over the Pacific shaped modern air doctrine. Radios, once seen as secondary, became the nervous system of aerial warfare. Coordinated tactics like the Thatch Weave evolved into entire doctrines of networked combat, laying the foundation for Cold War air strategy. The rugged design of Hellcats and Corsairs inspired future American fighters, prioritizing survivability and firepower over fragile agility. The very concept of air superiority, achieved through technology, training, and production, became a cornerstone of U.S. military doctrine in Korea, Vietnam, and the Gulf War. U.S. Air Force Doctrinal Report, 1991. The legacy was both industrial and psychological. Japan entered the war with a plane that terrified its enemies, but without the capacity to replace losses or adapt its design. The United States entered with planes that seemed inferior, but with the ability to evolve, innovate, and mass-produce. By 1945, that difference defined the Pacific. The Zero had been outflown not just in the air, but in the factories, the classrooms, the training fields, and the laboratories. As the war closed, Japanese officers reflected bitterly on what had gone wrong. One post-war analysis noted, "We designed perfection for 1940. They designed adaptation for 1945. Japanese Air Technical Bureau Report, 1946. It was a fitting epitaph for the Zero, a masterpiece of engineering, but one that froze in time while the war raced ahead, and so the skies tell the lesson still. In modern war, agility alone cannot triumph. Firepower is not enough. It is the invisible threads, radios, factories, teamwork, doctrine, that decide who rules the air. From Guadalcanal to the Marianas, from the death of the Zero to the rise of the Hellcat, the truth became clear. In war, connection outweighs firepower, and speed, whether in the air or on the assembly line, defeats armor.